Thanks everyone for coming back to the next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, been a fascinating weekend with the election. In some senses it had been carrying on for quite a while, but there was a very decisive result coming through late Saturday night. Labor with enough seats to govern alone with a majority, the first time that's happened under MMP, and does really set the scene for what the next 3 years is going to look like and remove some of the handbrakes we've seen over the previous term.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about whether Labor, what sort of arrangement they might have with the Greens, and we're still yet to see that. But I mean, obviously the Greens don't have a great deal of leverage in terms of the position going forward, because Labor doesn't need them to pass legislation. So, look, I think, we've seen previously under the national government with John Key bringing the Māori Party in particular into the tent, even though he didn't necessarily need them. And I think that Labor will do that in some fashion, but the policies that they'll give towards the Greens will be reasonably limited and probably reflect the areas where there is common ground anyway. So I'm thinking around taking further action in terms of poverty and some of the policies there where certainly not as extreme as the Greens might be proposing, but where Labor are comfortable with them, and also around the environment. And that's probably one of the areas where New Zealand First was something of a handbrake in the previous administration. I'd expect to see a bit more progress towards some of those climate change issues coming through.
Absolutely, and like you just sort of mentioned, the likes of the change with New Zealand First now no longer Parliament does actually shake things up a little bit. Although businesses are likely to, I guess, have a pretty similar view of the government. There haven't been any wild swings in the financial markets or similar, and I think that reflects the view from businesses that this is more of sort of continuing with the same, and so there is that stability in terms of thinking. Although I guess the challenge now is that on one hand you don't have New Zealand First as a handbrake on some policies. On the other hand, though, you also don't have New Zealand First stopping any sort of really wild changes that might have been proposed by others, particularly the Greens, in terms of having a bit of a different view than what the sort of central political position might be. And so I guess that is going to be one to watch over the next few years, is just how quickly Labor is able to get things going and where it actually might restrain itself. I guess the challenge, though, Gareth, is that what does this mean in terms of the policy execution from the government? We've been concerned in previous times that things have been much too slow to actually get going. The government was good at press releases, but not necessarily getting shovels in the ground, if you will. Do we see that changing going forward?
I think there's a couple of issues to canvass there. One is firstly, obviously, with COVID and the amount of expenditure that's gone on through the course of this year. The sort of fiscal wriggle room for the government going forward from here is relatively limited. So we're not going to see massive changes in policy or massive sort of spending increases that wouldn't otherwise have been expected anyway. The second issue I'd probably canvass is that while the Labor Party has had some policies out there ahead of the election, but there's no real major big ones like we had ahead of 2017. Your sort of flagship policies, much like Kiwi Build and light rail in Auckland, for example. Now, light rail, I think, is still on the table, but the absence of any larger policies and a reflection, I think, on what we've seen over the last few years, where they have really struggled or failed to implement those large promises that they'd made. So to me, it suggests that it is going to be very much steady as she goes. And I think Jacinda Ardern, in terms of the way she has engaged with the public and tried to maintain support levels, very much taking a leaf out of John Key's book and really aiming for the centre of the political spectrum, and has obviously done that very successfully.
Yeah, and one of the things you just highlighted there around, being a bit of a policy light election in many senses is, I think, something that we need to keep in mind here. On one hand, it is steady as she goes. We do have business as usual, if you will. But from a business point of view, people are going to be looking and saying, look, are there actually any big policy changes to come out? And if so, how quickly and clearly are they signalled to businesses? And also, I guess, more what happens when we do have to start confronting some of those big thorny issues. We've got high debt loading. What happens eventually to our revenue settings? Where might we change expenditure? Is there any trimming of the fat and similar that needs to go on? And all of those sort of changes are, I think, going to be areas to watch. The other two, in my mind, is that the government has been pretty forthright. Labor Labor rather has been pretty forthright in saying that the minimum wage will increase again this year. Now that is going to hit businesses in terms of their costs, as well as some of the climate change action, which is likely to at least make or put farmers in similar offside, which is going to be an interesting compromise position in some senses because of how important the primary sector currently is to New Zealand's sort of solid economic foundations moving through COVID. So I think we're going to have to watch those as well into the future.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, the way the votes fell on Saturday night, there was quite a lot of support, a lot more than usual for the Labor Party through some of those provincial areas. It'll be interesting to see how that does pan out around some of those, fresh water and climate issues, and whether they have been overblown in terms of the concerns around those, or whether Labor does come through and push more changes potentially onto farmers as well.
Absolutely. Look, fascinating times as always. We'll continue to watch not only how the formation of government goes, but also what that direction looks like and what sort of hints that we can see in the early stages of this new electoral term. Always great to chat, Gareth, and I'll catch you and everyone else on the next edition of Econ Talks.